This is Duke University.
Thank all of you for coming. I'm Jonas, Monast. I direct the Climate and Energy Program at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. For those of you who don't know us, we're just a short, nice walk that direction on Campus Drive. Sarah Adair, my colleague at the Nicholas Institute, and I are going to talk about a paper that we just had accepted for publication at the Hastings Law Journal that explores the role of public utility commissions in the energy innovation process. And the publication process is going to take some time, so we have the next couple of months to do some revisions to the paper and get back to them. So what we hope to do today, we want to obviously present the work that we're doing so that you have an idea about where we're going, but also use this as an opportunity to both answer your questions but also get feedback, especially when we get towards the end of the presentation where we're suggesting some alternatives for dealing with the challenge of utility commissions when they're viewing a proposal to install a more expensive, potentially more technologically risky technology to produce electricity that may have broad societal benefits. All right. So please feel free to offer feedback. Let me go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to spend the first half here just kind of laying the groundwork, talking about the energy innovation process, talking about the Public Utility Commission process. I'm guessing that most of the students here have probably had Dahlia's class or are somehow familiar with the PUC process, so I won't spend too much time on that, but I think it's important for this discussion to at least discuss the basics. And then I'll describe what we're calling the energy innovation premium. Then Sarah's going to get up and talk about some specific case studies, recent case studies where the public utility commissions have considered proposals by utilities to build first-generation, large-scale electricity generation facilities. And in some of the case studies, the PUC decided that even though there was higher cost and higher risk associated, said yes, it actually is a benefit to the state, is a benefit to consumers, allowed the project to move forward. In other instances, did not, and talk about some of the lessons that we think are embedded in those case studies for why. And then we'll conclude by talking about some of the policy implications, have the discussion again where we hope to get your feedback on the work that we're doing here. So energy innovation. Energy innovation can be defined in a lot of ways. So smart grid technologies could be considered energy innovation. The O-Power business model that a lot of you, I assume, are familiar with can be considered an energy innovation, using energy efficiency as a resource bidding into the electricity grid. The way that we define energy innovation for this inquiry is large-scale generation, first generation, not necessarily first generation in the globe, but at least first generation here in the United States. And when we say large scale, we mean at a scale large enough that if a utility constructs the facility, that means that it's going to likely have an impact on consumer prices. And that's going to be one of the major concerns for the Public Utility Commission. So that's the lens that we used here when we're looking at energy innovation. In legal scholarship, there are volumes and volumes of papers that are looking at this idea of federalism. So federalism, the concept there is can be a role for the federal government, a role for state governments. When the 13 colonies got together and drafted the Constitution enumerates rights and responsibilities for the federal government. Any of those rights and responsibilities that aren't enumerated for the federal government then rest with the state government. So a lot of the questions around federalism are around jurisdiction. Is the federal government, by law, the actor? Does the federal government have jurisdiction? Does the state government have jurisdiction? In environmental law, a lot of the federalism structure is called cooperative federalism, where the federal government has a role. The EPA may set an emission standard. The states then figure out how to meet that emission standard within the state and which entities within the state have compliance options. But largely it's around jurisdiction. It's around regulatory mandates. It's also around whether the jurisdictional line was drawn correctly. Should the federal government be the actor here? Is it more appropriate for the state government to be the actor here? In energy innovation, it's a different inquiry. we still have a very clear role for the federal government. We still have a very clear role for the state governments, but it's not focused on that jurisdictional boundary. At the federal level, you may have, as I say, President Obama this summer, the Climate Action Plan, very lofty goals for federal government investing in energy innovation technologies, really focused on bringing the cost down. So that may be research and development funding at the Department of Energy and the national labs. It may be R&D funding for universities. It may be loan guarantees to bring the cost down and help the technology get into the marketplace. It may be the ARPA-E model that Eric Toon, who's here on campus, helped create a few years ago within the Department of Energy to provide assistance to companies that are getting these first-generation technologies in the marketplace, and also funding as well. But it's really based on incentives and the hope that if the right dynamic is in place, then the private sector will adopt the technology. So it's not a regulatory mandate often. Sometimes with environmental regulations, there may be a mandate to install a particular type of technology if you have a particular type of plant, but I wouldn't really call that an innovation policy. When you get to the state level, if you're actually going to build a multi-billion-dollar first-generation electricity technology, you run right into a very well-established regulatory structure at the state level. In many states, it's the same regulatory structure that's been in place since the beginning of the last century, that was developed right about the same time that Standard Oil was being broken up, that a lot of the energy regulation at the time was focused on controlling market power and protecting consumers. And that's the model that evolved with the public utility regulation, because we've got the utility, think here in North Carolina, we've got the natural monopoly of Duke Energy, where the regulatory bargain is Duke Energy does not face competition in the marketplace. In exchange for not facing competition in the marketplace, the state, the Public Utility Commission, sets the electricity rates that Duke Energy can charge to consumers, determines what rate of return Duke Energy can earn on a capital investment, and plays a very significant role in the decision-making process that Duke Energy goes through. So Duke Energy is not going to invest in a technology if Duke Energy doesn't think that the Public Utility Commission is going to allow it to pass those costs through, especially if there's another option that the Utility Commission would allow it to. So this is the dynamic. This is why we're framing this in a federalism context. We've got federal action, we've got state action. In order for the lofty federal goals to be realized, it's important to understand the dynamic at the state level, that the technology, that companies that want to install the technologies are going to have to navigate. We borrowed this slide from Kelly Sims Gallagher at Tufts University. She and her colleagues have done a number of papers on energy innovation. This one is focused on the energy innovation system. The more traditional model, or the more traditional, I guess, thinking around how innovation occurs is this linear process where you have research, you have development, you have deployment. Sorry, research, development, demonstration, and then deployment or diffusion. Gallagher in this paper, and she's not the only one to make this point, but I think she does a nice job in this piece, is to point out that it's actually a cycle, it's a feedback loop. So when you do research and then you do development, the development stage informs the next stage of research. When you move from research, development to demonstration, the demonstration, what you learn by actually building something to scale, feeds back on the next stages of research, feeds back on the next stages of development, all the way down the chain, all the way to diffusion. You continue to learn and improve. And this is how the technology learning curve occurs. What we focus on in the paper is this stage. Okay, so if you have a utility commission that looks at a technology and says, great, we recognize that this may have benefits to society, but it is a lot more expensive than a natural gas combined cycle turbine. And therefore, we do not believe, the utility commission speaking, we do not believe it's appropriate for our consumers that we are supposed to be protecting, relatively small number of consumers, if the benefit is supposed to be diffuse and help society. PUC may say, our consumers shouldn't have to pay a premium on electricity rates so that we, as society, can get this benefit of a technology. And then other utilities in other states can then install the technology once the cost has come down. Somebody has to be the first actor. The PUC plays that role to decide whether the utility within its state is going to be one of the first actors, get that demonstration project on the ground, allow that feedback loop to continue to occur. So Public Utility Commission regulation. I mentioned just a minute ago the history of the PUC. This affected with the public interest. This is language from a late 1800 Supreme Court case that found that a state can regulate economic activity of a private entity if that private entity is doing activities that's affected with the public interest. Electric utilities clearly are. So since that point, the legal authority has been there. The primary goal for public utility commissions is consumer protection. Other important roles for the Public Utility Commission include ensuring that the utility can make an adequate rate of return on its investments so that its shareholders have an incentive to continue to invest, so that the utility can continue to attract capital, so that the utility and the PUC can achieve the other goal of an affordable and reliable electricity grid. But this consumer protection goal, because of the regulatory bargain that the state has made with the electric utility, the PUC is very vigilant in making sure that investments that the utility makes are investments that are actually in the best interest of consumers. A lot of times that's interpreted as requiring a least cost mandate. So if there is new electricity generation that is necessary, making sure that the utility is investing in the generation option that is least cost, because that way you're assuring the affordable, reliable grid. The utility is making a rate of return on the capital investment, and consumers are only paying enough to meet that need and to ensure that the utility can continue to attract capital. Public utility commissions are very concerned about the concept of gold plating, right? So if a utility has a choice between spending $600 million on a new combined cycle, natural gas combined cycle plant, or $2 billion on a nuclear facility, if the utility gets a 12% rate of return on the full amount of the capital it invests, there's a natural incentive there to want to invest in the $2 billion option, right? Because then you're getting 12% return on $2 billion instead of 12% return on $600 million. So the gold plating idea is the utility seeking a more expensive option because the utility wants to do what's in the best interest of its shareholders and not doing what's in the best interest of consumers. That's the inquiry at the heart of the Utility Commission process. So there are two different regulatory models, generally two different regulatory models in the country for the utility commissions. One is the more traditional regulatory model, which is what we have here in North Carolina, where Duke Energy owns generation, Duke Energy owns transmission, Duke Energy owns distribution, delivers the electricity to consumers. We pay the rate that is set by the utility commission to Duke Energy for all these services. And the restructured markets, the process of restructuring was in vogue until the California energy crisis happened and the Enron scandals happened. But the restructuring process, it meant that the state required the regulated utility to divest itself of generation assets and largely of transmission, so that generation is competition in the marketplace for generation. The electricity generators will bid into the market, maybe a transmission operator. In most states, the distribution is still handled by a regulated utility, because this idea that it doesn't make sense to have competition in the delivery of electricity, because building transmission lines is very expensive. So we focus our case study largely on the traditionally regulatory model, because here the PUC plays such a direct role in how a Duke Energy, for example, would choose to approach generation. But we do have a case study actually that focuses on the restructured model as well, because these regulated utilities that deliver the electricity sometimes will enter into long-term power purchase agreements with electricity generators. And there are some examples of that utility, even though it only operates the lines, wanting to invest in, say, an offshore wind farm off of Rhode Island. And it's a similar inquiry. Offshore wind is more expensive than a natural gas combined cycle turbine. So the PUC would still, because it's concerned about the prices charged to consumers, would still question whether or not that's in the best interest or not. All right, last part before I let Sarah get up here and talk about the more interesting aspect of our talk. So this is a chart that we borrowed from the Annual Energy Outlook from 2013, produced by the Energy Information Administration, that looks at the total system levelized cost of different electricity generation options. So no secret here at the Nicholas School, natural gas prices are quite low and, unlike in the past, are projected to remain low into the future because of the shale gas boom, making advanced combined cycle plants and even conventional natural gas combined cycle plants largely the more economic option. The assumption is that they will be least cost to build and operate in a lot of circumstances into the future. So this is the starting point for the PUC. If new generation is necessary, least cost option looks like, if you only consider cost, don't consider other factors, it looks like least cost option would probably lead you towards natural gas. Mississippi Power, a subsidiary of Southern Company in Mississippi, is building an advanced coal with CCS, which, according to this chart, is more than twice as expensive as a natural gas combined cycle turbine. So cost is one aspect of this innovation premium that the PUC will have to get comfortable that there are enough benefits to the consumers within the state to be able to say yes to this type of investment. There's another aspect of it. The other aspect of the not just the levelized cost premium, but the technology premium. So anytime you're building a large power plant, investing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, you've got the risk that capital, labor, materials costs may be higher than expected. The project may be canceled over the long term. You may be building a facility that relies on a fuel where the fuel prices would spike. So there's some risk associated even if you're talking about conventional technology options. For the innovative technology, for the early generation large-scale technologies that are unproven in the marketplace or not as proven in the marketplace, there can be additional risks. So the technology may underperform. The IGCC plant that Duke Energy just completed in Indiana went down for a couple of weeks as soon as it became operational because it was having technology challenges. Contractor may be unable to complete the project. You may lose federal incentives. The CCS facility that I just mentioned that Southern Company is building in Mississippi just recently announced that it was not going to become operational in May of 2014. May of 2014 was the deadline in order to receive over $200 billion worth of tax incentives. So when the PUC in Mississippi approved it, they assumed that the $200 million was going to be there. Now, I'd say it's an open question, but at least as the agreement is written right now, they're going to lose those federal incentives. That's almost $200 billion that either has to, $200 million that either has to be borne by the shareholders of Southern Company or by consumers. And you may have a loss of supplemental revenue. The part of the business model for the CCS plant in Mississippi is to sell the CO2 that it's capturing for enhanced oil recovery. The assumption is that market is going to be there. The assumption is that price is going to be at a level that helps make the facility as a whole economic. So this is a way to think of the technology premium from the mindset of a utility commissioner. Okay, first inquiry: advanced natural gas combined cycle, $65.60 per megawatt hour. In order to jump from here to here, to believe that the increased cost and the increased risk premium is an appropriate investment, then there have to be other factors. And as Sarah will describe, sometimes the PUC will decide that there are other factors that are appropriate that make the investment the right investment. So some states have statutes that encourage the energy sector to use a particular fuel source. West Virginia has a lot of coal. West Virginia has a statute that says there's a preference for coal-fired generation. So that may help the PUC be able to to say yes, for example. As utilities right now are moving away from coal or retiring older coal-fired power plants and are replacing the generation with natural gas-fired generation, there's a concern that the fuel mix is less diverse. And if price spikes in the natural gas market occur in the future in the same way they've occurred in the past, then the consumers may be more vulnerable to the impacts of those price spikes. So there may be value in having diversity in the fuel mix, which may make it an appropriate investment for a more expensive technology such as CCS, even though it means that consumers will certainly bear a higher price. So it's this lens that we use when we were looking at the case studies. I'm not going to hand the microphone and the clicker over here to Sarah to talk about the specific work that we've analyzed in the States.
So hopefully I'll live up to Jonas's promise of being more interesting. I have a bit of a cold, so if I run out of the room coughing, it's not you, it's me. So as Jonas said, I'm going to just walk through a couple examples that we looked at. We actually, in our paper, draw on 11 examples. I'm going to run through 4 today that hopefully help illustrate the challenge that Jonas has just described kind of from the theoretical perspective and put some of this in context where we've actually seen it play out in recent years. Before I jump into the case studies, I want to show you this map. The first 2 case studies that I'm going to run through involve a company called Appalachian Power Company, and their service territory, you can see in this blue call-out box, you might not be able to see the state lines, runs through part of West Virginia and Virginia, so the southern half of West Virginia and the western half of Virginia. And they are a subsidiary of American Electric Power Company. And AEP's service territory is shaded in green, so it includes that blue portion, and then the other operating companies are shown in green here. So I'll come back to this dynamic a little bit later, but they're operating companies parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Ohio. And these 2 case studies I think are particularly interesting because Appalachian Power Company operates in both states. They need to actually go to both utility commissions and ask permission in order to build a facility that they would then recover the costs of from both West Virginia and Virginia ratepayers. So we get to see how 2 different commissions respond to the same project proposal and how some of those state policy dynamics that Jonas alluded to play out. So first case study, about 2007, Appalachian Power Company has a need for new baseload generation, and they think that climate policy is likely to be put in place at some point during the lifetime of that new facility. And so they proposed to build about 630 megawatt advanced coal power plant. It wouldn't have CCS installed, but part of the value proposition here is that if and when they needed to capture carbon from that facility, it would be more cost effective. The project is expected to cost about $2.23 billion, and they think that's 20 to 30% more expensive than it would cost them to build a similarly sized conventional coal-fired power plant. So the West Virginia Commission looked at this proposal first, and the first thing they said is, in their decision, this power plant, even if it came in under budget, would be the most expensive project we have ever considered as a commission in the history of the West Virginia Public Service Commission. So it's expensive. And the technology, we're relatively comfortable. It's been demonstrated at a smaller scale, about 250 megawatts plant operating in Florida. But it's riskier than the conventional coal alternative. And we see the benefit, the potential benefit, depending on what climate policy looks like in the future, but without knowing if and when that policy will be in place and what it will look like, it's hard to really assess whether this would be a cost-effective way to comply with that policy. But as Jonas mentioned, West Virginia has a piece of legislation that was enacted after the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments that established a preference for, or directed the commission to grant special consideration to projects that would employ clean coal technology to the extent that those projects would help ensure that there's a continued market for West Virginia coal. And so the commission looked at this project and said, well, it's high cost, it's high risk, the benefits are potentially uncertain or hard to quantify at this point in time, But this is exactly the type of project that the legislature was intending to enable or to facilitate with this piece of legislation. And so they granted the company permission to construct the facility despite the significant cost. Virginia Commission ruled a couple months later, and they similarly noted the high cost, high risk. They were more skeptical of the technology. They were more skeptical of the potential benefits. They said it's impossible for us to assess the benefit in terms of climate policy compliance without knowing what that climate policy is. And they said, this doesn't look like a good deal for Virginia consumers, so we're not going to grant you the certificate in order to build the plant. And the facility didn't move forward. So about a year later, undeterred by that previous experience, Appalachian Power Company, again, so they moved forward with a CCS pilot project at an existing coal-fired power plant in West Virginia. And they had plans to embark on a commercial scale demonstration project. And they had a grant from the Department of Energy for $334 million to complete that second phase commercial scale demonstration project. So that would have covered 50% of what they thought the commercial scale project would cost. But they had already started this pilot project. It was capturing CO2 from a 30 megawatt side slip at the facility. And they had already incurred some costs. And they went to both the West Virginia and the Virginia commissions as part of a general rate case and asked to recover the cost of that pilot project. So this was tens of millions of dollars, not hundreds of millions of dollars. And the Virginia Commission, again, ruled first. And they said, we think this project is creating benefits as there's learning benefits. The company is getting some experience with carbon capture and sequestration technology, which they might need in the future in order to comply with climate policy. But as the company itself pointed out, this project is really benefiting society, and it's benefiting all AEP ratepayers. So if you remember that map, the areas in green with other operating companies that are part of AEP's network. And the commission said, we think it would be fair for all AEP companies, ratepayers of all of these operating companies, to pay. West Virginia ratepayers shouldn't shoulder the whole cost of this project. It's really benefiting everyone. And so we're going to allow you to recover a portion of the cost that is commensurate with our portion of that footprint. And so they did some math and figured out what they thought was a fair portion. And they only allowed the company to recover that relatively small fraction of the cost. The Virginia Commission, again, looked at this second and had a similar reaction, said, this is really benefiting everyone. We don't think Virginia ratepayers should have to pay. And they didn't allow any cost recovery at all for this project. And the result of that was the Appalachian Power Company, AEP, abandoned that Phase 2 demonstration project, despite the fact that they had a grant from the Department of Energy that would have paid for 50% of that project. They still would have been seeking hundreds of millions of dollars for West Virginia and Virginia ratepayers, which from this experience they potentially weren't going to get. Example 3, Jonas mentioned the advanced coal project with carbon capture and sequestration under control in Mississippi. It was about 2007 when this project was proposed. The Mississippi legislature had just passed a piece of legislation called the Baseload Act. And the Baseload Act established a state policy preference for in-state baseload resources. So they said, Mississippi power companies, we would prefer that companies build generation in-state to serve Mississippi need rather than go out to wholesale markets and purchase energy. And there's value in those resources being diverse. And the legislation specifically mentioned that that would include advanced coal and nuclear technologies. At the time, Mississippi Power Company was getting 50% of their energy from natural gas. And this was before the shale gas boom, so there was some more concern about natural gas price volatility than you might see today. And so Mississippi Power came to the Mississippi Commission with a proposal to build an advanced coal-fired power plant so it would actually capture 65% of its carbon dioxide emissions. It would burn locally mined lignite, which is a low-grade coal, and it would be burned literally on-site or mined on-site next door, so it would be a cheap and stable fuel source for that plant. And at the time, they thought it was going to cost them $2.4 billion. Mississippi Commission looked at this proposal and they did something interesting. First, they said no. They said this project, but they actually invited the company to come back with an alternative proposal in their order denying the certificate. So they said, we think this project could be in the public interest, but the terms of the agreement don't protect consumers. There's too much risk for consumers if this project, if there are issues with the technology, if it ends up costing more than you think it's going to cost, we don't want consumers to be footing the bill. And so the company came back with a proposal that actually accepted a $2.88 billion cost cap. And as Jonas mentioned, the timeline for when that plant's going to be operational has been pushed back, and they've actually exceeded that $2.88 billion cost cap. So that means that after $2.88 billion, even if the costs are prudently incurred, the company can't ask ratepayers to shoulder those costs. So they're absorbing those additional costs that they're seeing now. Southern Company shareholders are. Last example. As Jonas mentioned, Rhode Island is a restructured state, so their electricity distribution companies still are regulated by the Utility Commission in Rhode Island, but they go out to the wholesale market and purchase energy. They don't actually own generation facilities. But in 2009, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed a piece of legislation that directed those distribution companies on an annual basis to go out and solicit proposals for renewable energy facilities, long-term contracts for renewable energy. And in that piece of legislation, they also said, we think it would be in the public interest to construct an offshore wind demonstration project off the coast of Block Island, which I think is this little island right here hiding behind the wind farm, if you're looking at the map. And they directed the Public Utility Commission to approve those long-term contracts if the terms and pricing are commercially reasonable. And they said commercially reasonable means similar to what you would expect to see from other renewable energy developments. And so National Grid, which is the primary distribution company in Rhode Island, went out and issued a request for proposals, as they were told to. And they received one application, and it was for an offshore wind demonstration project off the coast of Block Island. That project would be 6 turbines, about 22 megawatts, and the contract would be for energy at a price of 24.4 cents per kilowatt hour, escalating at a rate of 3.5% annually. And the Rhode Island Commission estimated that this would result in about $390 million in above market costs. So the Rhode Island Commission looked at this project and they said, is this commercially reasonable? And they came to the conclusion that no, it's not. And in that assessment, they looked at what would we expect to see from other renewable energy projects, not just small-scale offshore wind projects off the coast of Block Island, but onshore wind farms, solar, PV. What's a reasonable price for renewable energy broadly. And they recognized that there are some local economic development benefits potentially and environmental benefits from this project, but they said even if that was part of the definition of commercially reasonable, it's not big enough to offset that $390 million in above market costs. The Rhode Island General Assembly went back and they amended the definition of commercially reasonable, only as it applies to a offshore wind demonstration project off the coast of Block Island. So not for all PPA, all of these proposals that come through under this RFP mandate, but just for a small-scale offshore wind demonstration project. And they directed the Commission now to determine if that price was commercially reasonable by comparing it to what you would expect to see from an renewable energy development of similar size, technology, and location. So compare it to itself and determine whether it's commercially reasonable. And so the Utility Commission went back with this new directive, and they quite reluctantly actually approved the project. And in their decision, they were clear that unless the definition of commercially reasonable is changed for other projects, this is not the standard that they would use to assess future future renewable energy long-term contract proposals. So they felt that this was not really a good deal for Rhode Island ratepayers. So what do we learn by looking at these projects? First, as Jonas mentioned, the innovation premium that he showed you, that wedge of extra cost and extra risk, makes PUC approval challenging, even if commissioners believe the technology is necessary. So even the Virginia Commission, which was pretty adamant in not wanting Virginia ratepayers to pay for these types of projects, is very complimentary of the fact that the company was pursuing these types of endeavors. They just said, not on our dime. These are things that society is really benefiting from, and we don't think it's fair that Virginia ratepayers of Appalachian Power Co are paying these really high costs that everyone else is benefiting from. And so there's this mismatch between who's really benefiting from these early stage projects where there's really a learning benefit to society, and that's really more important in many cases than that potential local economic development benefits or the marginal emissions reductions that you're getting from one project. And state policy preferences help. In the cases where we've seen these projects actually receive approval, it's usually been in a case where the legislature has passed a piece of legislation that kind of elevates a non-cost concern in the commission's eyes. So in Mississippi, there's some value in having diversity. So we want to encourage not just the least cost resource, but resources that add to our fuel diversity. In Virginia, West Virginia, it was this clean coal technology preference. In Rhode Island, it was a dogged pursuit of an offshore wind demonstration project off of the coast of Block Island. So when we think back to the larger goals of accelerating technology innovation, we want to think about how these projects are received at the state level when they're utilities that the federal government is providing incentives. We want people to put these projects on the ground. And they're running into roadblocks potentially at the state level where utility commissions are set up to protect consumers. So kind of taking it back to that larger perspective, we mentioned, as Jonas showed earlier, demonstration and deployment is part of a cycle. In order for innovation to succeed, we need these types of projects on the ground. So one thing that we're starting to think about is, what types of policy or strategies could utilities and states adopt that would help utility commissions say yes to these types of projects. One obvious strategy is to increase the cost of conventional technology. So if there was a price on carbon dioxide, that conventional coal-fired power plant would not have looked as cheap in the Virginia Commission's eyes relative to the advanced coal power plant that might have been able to cost-effectively capture CO2. Another strategy is to decrease the cost of innovation. So this is the theory behind the federal grants, that $334 million from the Department of Energy that would have helped offset the cost of the Phase 2 CCS demonstration project that Appalachian Power Company had proposed. But potentially there are other ways to share cost and risk more broadly that don't require these kind of grand policy solutions or more money from the federal government. Just to quickly illustrate the benefit of sharing cost and risk and why that might, including a broader range of consumers or utilities in these types of projects might help make that an easier yes for commissions. You might not be able to read this, but this is just an illustrative example of the rate impacts of a hypothetical $1 billion advanced coal demonstration project. And this project, we look at what would the rate impact be if this project is undertaken by an individual utility serving 500,000 residents. So how does this cost or this project impact rates? The average cost per kilowatt hour would be just under 3 cents. And if we compare that just for a benchmark to the 2011 West Virginia residential rate, that's a 29% increase in your electricity rates. So hard sell at the Utility Commission. If that project were spread among all consumers in an individual state with 4 million residents, now we're looking at a 4% increase in relative to the West Virginia residential rate in 2011. And if we spread that cost across the top 5, all consumers in the top 5 coal states nationally by percentage of generation, it's a 1% increase. So easier to swallow, easier to look at those economic developments, the economic development benefits, the learning benefits, and say maybe this is a good investment. So what are some possible strategies for sharing cost and risk? These are just a few ideas, and then I'll open it up for discussion, and we can talk more about other possible ways of doing this. But one model is joint utility ownership. So this is something we've seen with nuclear power plants, which are similarly expensive and risky. So if multiple utilities co-own the facility and ratepayers in multiple jurisdictions are contributing, the cost and risk taken on by individual ratepayers, which is really the lens through which the Public Utility Commission is viewing this, becomes a lot smaller and potentially easier to say yes to as a utility commission. You can think about an innovative technology portfolio standard, potentially another mechanism of encouraging multiple utilities to purchase output from one innovative generation facility. Illinois actually has a clean coal technology portfolio standard, which would create a market for the electricity from the Future Gen project, if it ever, or another advanced coal project, if it were built in Illinois. You can think about multi-utility long-term contracting requirements. So the example in Rhode Island, and there are other examples in other states where General Assemblies or where states have told utilities to go out and seek RFPs, either for renewable energy or in some cases specifically for innovative technologies. Minnesota had one for an advanced coal project. But it's usually been a single utility purchasing the output of a single facility. And that creates the same dynamic where there's one utility's ratepayers paying the potentially high cost and risk project. So if there are multiple utilities buying a fraction of the energy from a single project, you could spread that cost and risk more broadly. And another option would be state funding to offset, to supplement potentially, for example, Department of Energy grants. So states could create pools of funds, for example, through wires charges or some other funding mechanism that extends the cost of that facility beyond just a single utility's ratepayers. And of course, as we saw in this example, there's potential significant benefit of states working together to do these types of things, but there are also added complexities if we think back to the example with Appalachian Power Company, where they were seeking permission from both the West Virginia and the Virginia Commission. The more actors you get involved, the more states you potentially have to convince that this is a good idea.